for a little bit longer? How many people do we have in the stream?
There's quite a few actually.
Oh, great.
Like I can't, like the ones you're seeing on the desktop are not all of them. So yeah, I
Great.
think you can kick off. Yeah.
Excellent. So good evening and welcome to the launch of Eleanor Hogan's Into the Loneliness, this book here, The Unholy Alliance of Ernestine Hill and Daisy Bates, these two women who are virtually behind me. And I guess kind of in a historical and cultural sense behind many of us here, or Australia, or our literary past, if you like. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, host of Triple R's Backstory, and it's great to be here with you all today. Soon I will be joined, and in fact already am joined by Eleanor Hogan, who I'm sure many of you already know. We're going to have a bit of a discussion about the book and then open up the Zoom for an online mingle, which we've sort of given a bit of a taster for at the start of this very relaxed launch. So before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the original storytellers of Naarm or Melbourne, where I am, and they are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, here where their sovereignty was never ceded. I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and those of all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here on the stream today or in the communities that we are now occupying. So now let me introduce the woman you are all here to see. I'm very excited about this because Eleanor is a very dear friend. Eleanor Hogan is a literary non-fiction writer with a background in Indigenous policy research. Her writing, including her previous book, Alice Springs, Tiny Topic, draws strongly on her experience of working and living in Central Australia since the year 2000. Eleanor's biographical writing has earned her the Peter Blasey Fellowship in 2017 and the Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship in 2019. You may also have read her work in places like Meanjin, Inside Story, Island Magazine, Screen Hub, Kill Your Darlings, and the Australian Book Review, to name a few. The book we are here to launch today, Into the Loneliness, The Unholy Alliance of Ernestine Hill and Daisy Bates, is a biography of two fearless Australian women writers of times when that was that kind of intrepid calling of being an outback journalist was certainly not for the faint of heart. Still isn't. Daisy Bates and Ernestine Hill were best-selling writers who told of life in the vast Australian interior. Daisy Bates dressed a little bit like a scary ghost in Victorian garb, malnourished and half blind, camped with Aboriginal people in Western Australia and on the Nullarbor for decades, surrounded by her books, notes and artefacts as she worked as a self-taught ethnologist. In 1935, Ernestine Hill, the much younger journalist and author of The Great Australian Loneliness, coaxed Bates to Adelaide to collaborate on a newspaper series, and the result was an international bestseller. Now, Eleanor Hogan's own story of traveling great distances in her camper van to research the book is interwoven into the story she has written about these women's lives. As she travels and researches, she reflects on the lives and work of these indefatigable, I can't even say it. These are unflagging women. They are flawed and they are incredibly complex. From our modern day perspective, their work seems quaint and sentimental. Their outlook and preoccupations are dated at best, paternalistic, and even racist at worst. With sensitivity and insight, Eleanor wonders what their legacies as fearless female outliers might be. And this is such a fascinating thing that you've managed to do, Eleanor, because you are not letting them off the hook about anything, but you're also really bringing out the real people. So without too much further ado, I would like to formally introduce you to the woman who's been here this whole time, Eleanor Hogan. Eleanor, thank you so much for your wonderful book and joining us today.
Thanks for that very warm and fulsome introduction, Mel. I'd just like to say wada from Mabantua Alice Springs, which is Arrernte country, the homelands of the Arrernte people whose sovereignty was never ceded, and to pay my respects to the elders past and present. And to thank you all for coming and joining this unusual event of the Zoom launch of my book. It's a mixed blessing in that so many people from different parts of Australia, and even some people perhaps overseas have joined in, and some people who I don't even know have joined in too, which is fantastic. So I'm really flattered by your presence, and I hope that we can have a really interesting discussion, enlightening discussion about the book today.
Well, I have to admit, I am extremely excited to talk to you about this, as probably everyone can tell. You and I are friends, and we used to meet up quite regularly, often after Zumba class, for a glass of wine and a chat. And you started introducing me to the work that you were doing around this book, and in fact introduced me to these two women. I have to admit, and I'm wondering if it's because I'm a first generation or second generation, I should say, Australian, or if it's because I am avowedly Melburnian, that I had never heard of either of these quite, enormous characters. But you certainly have illuminated me, and I really, really want to know now how you got interested in them both, and what got you started on this incredible journey.
Yes, look, I would say that I was vaguely aware of both Ernestine Hill and Daisy Bates, and part of that would be to do with my parents, and I think particularly my mother's. I hope that she's watching today. Bookcase, which had books by Ernestine Hill, My Love Must Wait, and I think maybe The Great Australian Loneliness. So she was one of those strange, names of interwar writers that I was vaguely aware of. And also because I worked in Aboriginal affairs, and I'd done a women's studies degree in about 1990, which focused on post-colonial feminism. I looked at it in relation to the Australian context, and I became aware of Daisy Bates and also other figures like Annie Locke and Olive Pink, who were associated, I guess, with early kind of feminist and early European women's engagement with Aboriginal issues in particular. But really, I'd finished my book on Alice Springs, and I was interested in writing something about the period. There was a brief period of time, 1927 to 1931, when Alice Springs was actually the capital of Central Australia, a self-governing territory, just for 4 years. And I had this idea that I would find out who the European women and who any women were, in fact, which is harder to actually find out who the Aboriginal women are, because they were not documented, I guess, in standard Western ways that we're used to. But one of the figures that I came across was Ernestine Hill, who I'd heard about, who'd been visiting Alice Springs. And I became quite fascinated by her and her travels across the outback. And really, when I read The Great Australian Loneliness as part of my background research, I think I stumbled across it at outside Swinburne Uni in a book barrow. I was fascinated by the way she evoked Central Australia, because it was and Northern Australia, because it was very familiar to me. A lot of the sentiments she expressed about the pull of the place, about the multiculturalism of the place. Even back then in the 1930s, she was writing about the incredible ethnic diversity that there is in the northern Israel and the rest of the country. And it really, she also, there was a sense of adventure about what she was writing. She was very much into the kind of girl's own escapade. There was a lot of gender bender stuff about having to dress as a man and things like that, and being taken as a man to get around. And all of that quite fascinated me about her. And it's one of those things where I think you kind of presume that people in the past are less interesting, or perhaps have less of a handle on some of the things which we consider interesting, but you actually discover that these were themes all along. And then just in terms of Daisy Bates, she was someone I was quite wary of, and I couldn't actually find out that much online about Ernestine Hill. So I went to this library called the Friar Library. It's a special collection, a reference collection at the University of Queensland, when I was at a conference in Brisbane to see what I could find out. And I was really drawn into her collection, which was not what I was expecting to find. I was hoping to find hot gossip about Ernestine Hill's affair with R.C. Packer. There was not a trace of that. I was expecting to find all this kind of jolly hockey stick stuff about the outback, but it was actually the writing of a quite isolated, aging, middle-aged and then older woman reflecting on her career. And there was also this bundle of letters from Daisy Bates, and Daisy Bates was calling to her. Daisy Bates was holed up in this iron shed out the back of a farmhouse at Streaky Bay, which is a quite beautiful South Australian town, but it's about 700 kilometres from Adelaide. It's quite a way away, demanding that Ernestine Hill come and join her so they could work on writing an ethnography of Aboriginal people. And I was fascinated by this invitation and how persistent she was, and just the whole idea of two women from that era talking to each other about anthropology. So that's where my interest came from.
Yeah, I mean, and I do want to come back to this this unlikely friendship, because you refer to it as an unholy alliance, which I think is a delightful description for these two very different women, or women who had very different perspectives on the same subject matter, but at the same time really shared these, this outlier status. They were both women who, literally were traveling through the loneliness, and although, as you say, how lonely was it when there were so many others there? But we'll get to that. I want to pause for a moment on Ernestine Hill, as we can all tell your warmth for her really, well, it leaps off the page, and certainly it's very apparent now that she was your way into this story. And I kind of, reading her character, I get this this feeling that the sort of character she puts forward is someone from like a 1930s film, like dressed in, in kind of like pants and like, smoking a cigarette and being this kind of hard bitten sort of, wisecracking journalist type out there, the one woman among many, many men, but she's holding her own. That's very much the character that comes through. And it's certainly a character that she wanted people to read on the page. But this is one of the great delights, I think, of the kind of research that you've done and the kind of writing that you've done, that you've really dug beneath this persona that was shown to the world, and you found these extraordinary things in her notes. And I just want to read a little bit from your introduction to this book. You say, you've gone through and you've sort of talked about, the way she discussed things, and then you say, but Hill's note taking had a compulsive aura of a writer snared in her own web of semiosis, endlessly scribing it, unable to articulate her vision, scrambling to shore up her fragments against the tide of time. And I love this idea that she's this far more serious, concerned person who sees this vast inequity going on. She describes, I think you've mentioned this sort of proto-multiculturalism, where she says, that there's white Australia below the 20th parallel and black, white and brindle struggling above it. This is obviously of deep concern to her. It's the concerns that we still carry, this inequitable Australia. Weirdly flipped, because we often think of the North as being evidence of the great wrongs that still continue, but in many ways she saw it as evidence of how people could coexist. And she was unable to really write about that. And you sort of see how she's sort of struggling to really try and pull together these vision and put it into the words that then come out somewhat in, translated into this girl's own adventure type of writing. Can you talk a bit about this? Because I am utterly fascinated by the duality of Ernestine Hill and our presumptions about the past and about the linearity of like progress, that the people in the past can be forgiven for thinking things that we now think are awful because they didn't know better, and yet here we have someone who clearly did.
Yes, and this was an aspect of Ernestine Hill which really interested me, and I found it more interesting when I went to her archive, which is, perhaps what a typical academic or quasi-academic such as myself is going to say, that they love the archives. But what was really interesting about the archives is that a lot of the kind of presentiments which she expresses about how Indigenous people are being treated in frontier situations are really fleshed out a lot more. And she's really a lot more straight out in her notes about it. There is a bit of a problem with timing of the notes because she and other family members and other people typed up the notes a bit later on, but she does actually express a lot of these sentiments in a notebook from the 1930s, which would have been her first trip across, outback Australia, as it were, which now the word the outback is a huge generalisation to me. I think there's always been a kind of strong division between the South and the North here, though, as I say in my book, it's actually a bit hard to say where the South and the North begins. And as you say, it's sort of like Northern Australia is like the deep South of America, that there's a presumption that it's more racist and, more sort of recalcitrant in many ways. And Louise Campbell, who's the second cousin of Ernestine Hill and the copyright holder of her estate, when I interviewed her, she was very generous to me. She said like it was much more of a thing in those days, that people were much more aware of it. And I think it's tacitly here. It's still sort of tacitly here, like to me, like what's often a disinterest in the North. And, Southern journalists go on a foray to the North and they find out, go and see what Clive Palmer's doing. Of course, he's doing something crazy, and go back and write about it as evidence that, Queensland is crazy. I'm caricaturing a bit, but it's that sort of journey. Whereas Ernestine Hill was actually from the North, so she was quite sympathetic towards the North, and she was trying to convey this life that she knew through her journalism. And I think The Great Australian Loneliness, it wasn't her first book. There was another book called Water into Gold that she really wrote at a cracking pace a few months before, because she had this crazy obsessive compulsive routine that went for hours each day. But The Great Australian Loneliness, it's sort of a bit like a first book in that it's a bit rough around the edges. And I think that's its charm, because in some ways she doesn't really close down some of the ideas. It's a very sort of rough book in some ways. She leaves it hanging. So in parts of it, she can be on board with government policy saying, isn't this strange, people from different races marrying? And at other times, she'll be delighting in some of the contradictions. And that's why I think it's a really interesting book for these days, because it expresses so many different sort of voices from the North and gives such a texture. And, as she's saying, like, we really overlook what's happening in the rest of the country, that there's this whole life going on, black, white and brindle struggling, and it's sort of, the sanctimonious South living their own kind of domestic life. I'm not too sure if I'm going off track here.
No, it's absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have to remember, obviously, these ideas of, miscegenation, as you talk about, and obviously some of the horrors that were to come that were drawn from these awful eugenics ideas that had taken hold in many places. We're still, we're very much hitting their heyday around this time. And obviously the beginnings of the awful story of the stolen generations that we're still feeling the legacy of now, was happening at the time. So for her to be addressing these things in the way that she did in her notes is incredibly important to note, because I guess when we're looking back over our history, it's very easy to sort of to dismiss the way things could have gone, and maybe look at now and question what we're not looking or talking about now enough. When you see things like this, I think it's incredibly important. I feel like this is a very neat way to sidle into a discussion of Daisy Bates, a very problematic figure in many ways, but one that is surprising. So like, I have to say, I entered this book and very much guided by you. I have to admit, because I really knew nothing about Daisy Bates. But once I'd started reading, I realized I knew a lot about Daisy Bates because her ideas had in fact informed many later, writers, researchers, ethnographers, and she'd been incredibly influential for good and for ill. She is, when it comes to things like this idea of miscegenation, Daisy Bates did not cover herself in glory. She was notoriously critical of mixed race people. She did and said some truly horrendous things around that topic. And what's really interesting is that when you first start researching this book, you get the idea that among the descendants of the Aboriginal people with whom she spent a lot of time, she, just to recap, lived for years on end with various Aboriginal communities, and really, documented them and their doings at length. Saw herself as a protectress of them, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the descendants of them, as far as you could tell, had passed on stories about her as something of a bogeyman. Like,
Yes.
her name was used to scare children, in a very real sense, about perhaps being taken away. So she became as you put it, a cipher for white women's welfare activities on the area of Aldia and beyond, kind of in relation to the stolen generation. So she really became almost emblematic of the great wrongs that was done with supposedly good intentions. But just as a little twist, you've gone into this story kind of really not liking this woman at all, really seeing her legacy as somewhat of a damaging one. But then you actually talk to people from that region, the Ananu people, the Ananu, and ask them what they think. And the story they give you is a much more complicated one. Can you talk about that? Because I find that the most surprising element of the book.
Yeah, and it was also a surprising element for me. I mean, I found Daisy Bates fascinating, and I think many more people have heard of Daisy Bates than they have heard of Ernestine Hill, and she sort of has this lasting legacy, as you say and I say, of the being like a signifier of the woman on the frontier, living alone, and that owes actually a lot to Ernestine Hill's mythologising of her through the newspapers and then the writing of the passing of the Aborigines. I guess, in some ways, she sort of was like the ultimate antagonist and someone I found really difficult. And I remember going to a dark night of the soul with Pip McGuinness, the publisher of the book, just after I had accepted the contract, saying, I don't know that, maybe this should just be all about Ernestine Hill. I think I should get rid of her. And they were a bit kind of, oh no, we want Daisy Bates because people have heard of her, kind of thing. So I'm caricaturing a bit. So I went on this journey and I, across the Nullarbor, and it's in the book, and I went to see Anu to see what they had to say. And I really expected them to confirm what I had to say, which I think is a sort of a fallacy that researchers fall into and that you have to guard against, because often the reality is a lot more complex. And basically, I met with some older women, one of whom had camped with Bates in her camp as a child, and other people who were slightly younger. And when I say slightly younger, I mean in their 70s, so not that much younger, who had family stories. And they were very positive about Bates because they were people of full Aboriginal descent, and they had positive memories because she'd actually protected them. She protected them from the police and other authorities, people trying to take them from their camps and things like that. But when I talked to the younger generation who were not that young, but in their 40s, like the children, they were much more negative. And so I had like the two discourses really, and I'm generalising, that Ananu had to say about her. And the reason why people tend to be negative in the younger generation is because of the legacy of the stolen generation. and the belief that Bates was involved in removing children from their parents. And so I did actually talk to them at length about this, and not all of that conversation is in the book because of expediency. But I did actually find it hard, and I couldn't go into a full search through records for various reasons, the scale of project, confidentiality, but I did actually find it hard on the public record to find that many instances of Bates removing children. I felt that what it was more was that her views about the need to preserve the purity of the race, the fact that people of mixed descent were sort of inferior and doomed to this terrible life unless they assimilated, was actually feeding the activities and beliefs for people. So I think that she really became a symbol of the activities of an era. And, the passing of the Aborigines, which has some beliefs about racial purity and that kind of thing, I think is, is influential in that. So you can read what I have to say and think about it. I did find it interesting that another researcher by the name of Eleanor Whitcomb, surprisingly, another Eleanor had gone there with Isabel White, who's an anthropologist in the early 80s. She was hoping to write a screen play with Katharine Hepburn starring as Daisy Bates. All these plans for screen films never took off. But she actually found the same, a very similar finding, that the younger generations were negative and the older were positive. And I think it's because she did actually protect people to some extent.
I think, look, you were interviewed by Geraldine Doogue of the ABC recently, and in that interview, she actually asked her a question that I think is incredibly apposite here. Bates, I feel like, to hide from her, or her, complex legacies, to hide from the complex legacy of Australia itself. And I guess the question that Doogue asked you was, do these women kind of really reflect the history that we both feel uncomfortable about, but also is our history that we have to own, whether, like me, we're second generation migrants, or settlers or Aboriginal people. This is what happened, and these were the well-meaning people of their times. Many thought some of the things Bates did at the time were considered by many to be maybe not as well-meaning and more opportunistic. And I'm not going to spread, again, you talk at length about some of the scurrilous rumours she spread as well, about, cannibalism that have been were completely discredited at the time, but perhaps were her trying to get a little bit more notoriety or interest in her research, or perhaps some funding, because she never got paid for what she did, which is also another little twist. But the converse thing that, again, we have to look at is a lot of what she did in her research, wrongly assuming that Aboriginal people were dying out, which they are far from doing, is actually still somewhat important. Like, she has actually gathered together information and material about communities, their legacies, their practices, their language, that are still drawn on today. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, she did, she did write some very extensive annotations of different languages and different practices within different communities. And these are still used by anthropologists in native title claims. Often I was told by one lawyer to work out who was in which location. I don't think that these things are necessarily sort of taken on face value without being tested against other things. Other writing and other perceptions, but they still play a part. The other work that's occurring is Nicholas Teberger is I hope I said his name the right way, is a linguist who's compiled a huge database of different languages and dialects that Bates transcribed, and that's actually a reference tool that Aboriginal people can use these days. And I've seen, there's other hermeneutics type projects where, say, Indigenous people from that area on the Bight actually engage with Bates's descriptions of a story and tell their own version of it and so forth. So I think, she did Perhaps, I think in the earlier part of her career, like when she began in West Australia, annotating languages, she was about 45. And I think in that period, between about 45 and 60, was a more sort of serious period for her as a linguist. And you have to, the other side of it is that she was a convent girl from Ross Cray. So she was really reliant on, probably, a 3 hours type education. She didn't have university education, and she wasn't always taken that seriously by, she wasn't taken seriously by male folklorists and anthropologists in universities at the time. But it is sort of an incredible achievement, I think, for someone from that background, and the fact that her work is still being used in that way. I do think that when she got perhaps into her late 50s and 60s, she was malnourished. She was probably showing the beginnings of vascular dementia. And that's and she started to get more into this kind of random social work and lobbying to have rations so she could bring people in, so she could keep doing her work. She started to write these really quite manipulative articles about cannibalism and so forth, and that's kind of more in the later period when she started to go off the boil, as it were. And goodness, yeah. I mean, she lived a life that many of us, not sort of validating what she actually wrote about, but she lived a life that, most of us wouldn't live, which was, camping for, decades in a series of tents between Perth and Aldea on the Nullarbor. Yeah, I might just turn on this light because I think, is it getting a bit dark here?
It's a tiny bit dark, but we can still see your lovely face. Well, I'll just wait for you to wander back. But I want to glide from here, because you obviously are talking about these women in great depth, but that didn't come from nowhere. You did an enormous amount of research. I really want to talk about this side of things because as an avid reader, I always love it when writers show a little bit of the way that they create these bodies of work, because an enormous amount of research, interviews, documentary material, letters, diaries, and actually your own travels, the stories of your travels, but actually physically being in a place to give you a sense of what it is and where it is, all form a part of this. So I really want to talk about how you went about doing all of these things and then pull them together. I know that's an enormous ask, but can you maybe discuss how you started to winnow these things to start to form a cohesive narrative, because you really have managed to wind it so smoothly together. 2 stories of 2 separate women, your own story of traveling, their story of friendship, and enormous numbers of interviews as well, giving people their voices within this text. Talk to me about how you pulled it all together.
Oh, goodness. Well, there's sort of, there's an aspect of work with writing, I think, where there's planning, and then there's another aspect where you're just trying to follow the story that is, if I can sort of paraphrase Ernestine Hill. So there were those 2 aspects of things. I guess I went to the archives, and as I said, I didn't find the person or the story I expected to with Ernestine Hill, and this other idea of writing about the 2 women emerged. Something which I did in the early days of my research, and I remember this moment of sitting outside at the University of Queensland in a particular cafe and going, right, I'm just going to write down the 5 major plot points of Ernestine Hill and Daisy Bates' friendship. So I used a technique from script writing, which I dabbled a bit with, where you identify the 5 major tentpole moments, which are sort of like the catalyst, call to action, I think first act break, midpoint, second act break, and then the climax. And that sort of shaped the narrative for me. That gave me something to hang off. Look, I manage things a lot. I don't know if you want to know the technical stuff. I manage things a lot with Excel, which I've never really liked, but I had to do it in the end because there was too much minutiae. But I also use Scrivener a lot as a, because I like a toy, as a way of organising information, but you can also like move things around and compile things in a different way and, make and I made, real sort of kind of sort of corkboard type things, and others, virtually, and things like that, to move things around. But essentially I was following that narrative. And then I had a reader's report early on from New South, well, maybe sort of midpoint on, and the suggestion was that I should bring myself more into the narrative, and that there'd actually be 3 sort of people in the narrative. And like Ernestine Hill, I'm more reticent, and I'm not keen on writing on myself, and I've never had any desire to write a memoir, which is what people do these days. Rather than write a semi-autobiographical novel, they start by writing a memoir, usually, when they want to write, but I've never been that person, really. So publishers want you to put yourself in the narrative and all this kind of business. So in the end, I relented, and I had all these notes which I'd taken about my journey across the Nullarbor, and thoughts on caravanning and so forth. So I started to weave them in, and also like the story of actually going across the Nullarbor, though it didn't unfold in the way I anticipated because of sorry business, which is a big part of working with remote communities. And that sort of logistically was difficult to deal with, but I think that whole narrative actually gave it a bit more drive to have me going in to try and find out these things about Ernestine Hill and Daisy Bates.
Yeah, and I think it really, I mean, having those moments where you're an interlocutor in the story, where you're asking the questions, where you're confused by the answers, is a very real response. And I think, much like you sort of getting the fragmentary evidence from notes behind the scenes, or talking about the roughness of how Into the Loneliness was written, I think it gives that sense of a construction that allows readers to sort of find themselves in the text as well. I think there's actually a question here that's come up in the chat. I'm just wondering if you can see it there, Eleanor.
I can see it. I can just see number 1.
Yeah.
It might be a great.
Yeah, I think that the question was, how long did it take for you to research and write the book? And I think that's actually a really good question.
Yeah. Oh no, there's Angela Daly from Glasgow is listening, so that's exciting. Hi, Angela, and hi anyone else who's from overseas. Yeah. So it really took me about 6 years to research and write. And it's taken about 7 years to publish because of COVID, and also because of the whole, the length which it takes to chase down copyright permissions and things like that, which are incredibly tedious, but I won't go there. Yeah, so I guess what I read was that it usually takes about 4 or 5 years for people to write a biography. I heard 2 years of research and 2 years of writing. So I was doing a double hander. So that's my excuse for taking longer, as well as bringing in this other material. I was very aware that there are about 5 biographical works about Bates. One's fictionalised. There's also all these other works, art and opera and so forth. So I didn't want to go into her story in the usual way that you would, worrying about birth certificates and husbands and things like that. So I actually started later in the narrative with her, and I started earlier with Hill, like I started going back to her birth, and I sort of wanted to kind of tunnel into Bates's psychology, as it were, and then go into some of the things which she was hiding, like her husbands and her her ignominious Catholic
which is
birth.
a whole other thing. I mean, I was hesitant to even embark on this, because all too often women from history who are very notable in their own right are then reduced to their associations with men from history.
Yes.
But there is certainly little Easter eggs in here that I think people will enjoy, like a connection between Ernestine Hill and the patriarch of the Packer clan, which I thought was really quite interesting, potentially the father of her child, or in fact probably the father of her child. And was it Breaker Morant? Did I get that right?
Yes, yes.
Daisy
right.
Bates and Breaker Morant. I had to laugh. Like, it was, perhaps Catherine Hepburn should play her after all. It seems right. for that
Or
kind of a
Judy Davis,
swashbuckling.
I think, to me is
Judy Davis,
the obvious
yeah.
choice, I think, for Bates. Yeah, yeah, and so I remember, like, when I was at school, seeing Breaker Morant, and also Kit Denton's book The Breaker came out around about then, and it was informed by Margaret Carnegie and Alan Queel and Jim Jarrett's research about Bates. People had gone and done the work with the birth certificates and the marriage certificates and found out these things, and it was a big, shock horror at the time. But I didn't think it was sort of a major reveal, because it was always quite established, and I was much more interested in this sort of dual narrative around her in relation to Anangu and Aboriginal people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and look, I love that was, just an aside, because there's so much more that you could have written just about these women, and I guess to reduce them to then these associations seems silly. But I just think it is also another interesting element that you can go off and have a look at when you are reading through this. We kind of we've got probably about under 20 minutes left of our time. So I do want to ask you one more question before we maybe go into some acknowledgements that I know you have and fully launch this wonderful book. I do want to talk about just a little element that I sort of loved. Just a little confession in my deep dark past. I once worked for a caravanning and camping magazine for the Packers, actually, embarrassingly enough, weirdly enough to make a connection here. And you write in a way that I think is so beautiful about caravanning. I absolutely never read anything quite as lovely as this when I was working on those publications. But I did want to say, you talk about how, Bates ultimately chose a caravan for many reasons. You quote her saying, "Caravan is a permanent structure built to defeat the weather in a way a tent never can. It is designed to be able to separate the occupants from both the environment and their neighbours. Cooking and washing take place inside, and the van has a rigid lockable parameter. It is a small house on wheels." And you say that it is particularly because you wanted the protection of a van's rigid lockable parameter that you didn't simply pack a tent in your bike panniers or your runabout's boot. And then you discuss this, like you talk about the fears that you had as a woman traveling alone, but also the beauty of sleeping in a swag under the stars. Then how, incredible it could be just to pull up in your van and lie on your stomach typing your day's worth of writing. And I just had this feeling of you on the road. It's really these gorgeous sort of scenes of a writer doing her stuff out there. You write so beautifully, Eleanor, really you do, and you pull in these great descriptions of yourself, of your environment, revealing the writer's life in a way that I found incredibly moving, and perhaps more revealing in some ways of Bates, particularly Ernestine Hill, I would say, and what she would have done, but maybe Bates as well. It was a wonderful coming together of three writers. Talk to me. Firstly, I have to congratulate you on that. I found it so delightful, and I'm glad you were forced to do it.
Invited, shall we say.
Yeah, can you tell me about writing these bits? Because I was moved by them, and I wonder how you felt writing them yourself.
Look, I'm part of various camping and caravan groups, I have to say, online. And there's a women's group, which is just the best group, where we talk about these things all the time. It's really interesting, people's fears and different people's limits around these things. I guess, and I have actually, as I say, I've gone on this crazy bike ride with a crazy but lovable vet from Alice Springs, where we'd sort of slept by the road and washed in, you sort of start to lose your inhibitions after a while, and, washing in streams by the side of the road, that kind of thing. And on the other hand, I was quite tired of the life where you go to some sort of horrible hotel and the windows are sealed, and you have to, you know, sleep with some horrible synthetic Zuna and air conditioning to get the temperature right. So to actually be out having a way of going, you know, traveling great distances, but being actually a bit closer to, I know this sounds really corny, but a bit closer to nature, but still having the kind of convenience of a van was great. Like, it was sort of this conversion experience for me. Even more so than a car, you can just chuck things in. Whereas with camping, there's always this great palaver as you unload things and set up camp for the night. And, you know, you can do that in a much more seamless way in a van. So it was, it just sort of, you know, it sort of was sort of like the ideal kind of mode of transport for me in the end. The other thing which I would say about it was there's a kind of a sense of a psychological, I think, just having to let go and having to be comfortable with things, having a sense of self-possession with camping, that I imagine that Ernestine Hill and Bates would have had to go through as a woman to say, well, I'm just going to stop worrying about these things unless they happen. And as is so often said, women are much more at danger in intimate partner relationships, unfortunately, than they are at danger from strangers. I mean, my biggest issues came from bogging vehicles, which had, you know, there's one account in the book, but I've certainly bogged vehicles a couple of more times than that. And that sort of mechanical side of things and what you do in those situations. There's
running out of petrol or water.
Yes,
Yeah,
much
those kinds of things.
much more
Yeah.
problematic than, you know, sort of meeting with Bradley John Murdoch or someone like that in the outback. It's a much less likely scenario. So like Ernestine Hill, I sort of ended up agreeing that on the whole, mostly one meets with friends, and occasionally some man telling you that you solar panels are pointing in the wrong direction.
And also, like Ernestine, you didn't carry a gun.
No, no.
Which you've been encouraged to do. So
no, well, it's not America, so I wasn't carrying a gun.
Nothing illegal happened.
No.
No. which you know, I think actually probably puts one more in danger. Well, look, I would love to continue to talk to you. Also, I have to say, I defy anyone to read this and not immediately want to go and become a caravanning writer. So that's just a thing that's going to happen. I'm letting you know right now. But I really need to give you an opportunity now to thank all those you would really like to thank, Eleanor.
Yeah, and I have to say there's a long list of people in the back of my book. So if you're not mentioned here, this is sort of the brief list. Maybe you are in the back of the book. So sorry if I don't mention you here. Look, I'd just like to acknowledge that in the early days, Aviva Tuffield, who people know, many of you know, perhaps involved in the Stella Council originally and various publishing houses now at UQP, was a great encouragement to me in telling me to keep on writing about women in the outback, because it's not necessarily a popular subject in a city, Melbourne, it has to be said. Lucy Sussex, in the early days, listened to me talking a lot about how I would write about them and was very encouraging of me to embark on doing a double-handed, writing about two women, as was Peter Brown at the Institute for Social Research. I think he put me onto Brenda Niles' book True North about Elizabeth and Mary Durack. Angus Gordon and Delia Faulkner, if you're listening, two literary friends of mine who listened to me go on about this and had various conceptual suggestions to offer, which of a literary nature, which were helpful. I owe a big debt to Joe Case for reading and commenting on an earlier draft of the manuscript and encouraging me to put myself into the narrative again. Librarians at many institutions across the country. I'd particularly like to mention Simon Farley and Kerry Klump at the Friar Library for their assistance with many things. Philippa McGuinness, if she's listening, my publisher on Alice Springs, and also on this book for her warm and insightful steering and encouragement along the journey with this book. Also Tricia Dearborn, my copy editor, and others at New South, such as Emma Hutchinson, the long-suffering project editor, Elspeth Menzies, Harriet McInnery, and Caitlin Lawless. Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge that the project was begun with seed funding from the Swinburne Institute for Social Research and was assisted by an Australia Council grant, and also the Peter Blasey Fellowship 2017 and the Hazel Rowley Fellowship. And I'm really grateful for the work that these organisations do. I'm an independent worker. I wasn't a member of an academic department, and I don't think I could have written this book in the period that I wrote it, in 6 years, without their support. Antonia Alexis and Hugh Craig at the University of Newcastle were helpful in doing a linguistic computing analysis of the authorship of the Passing of the Aborigines, which corroborated Ernestine Hill's claims that she played a significant role in the writing of the book. I'd like to thank Louise Campbell, who is the second cousin of Ernestine Hill and the executor of her estate, for her support over the years and for fielding many questions and for meeting with me in her home early on and showing me various manuscripts from the family. I'd also like to thank Roberta Bonnen, who is the sister of Marguerite Bonnen, who did interviews with Ernestine Hill and her son Bob, for making those available to the Friar Library. And I'd like to thank Bronwyn Druce of Red Kangaroo Books in Alice Springs, who's just been a phenomenal support to me in giving me tips about book promotion, something that writers like me are not keen on doing, but it's a kind of necessary evil. She's been really super supportive in these last phases. And of course, I'd like to thank Yalata Anunu Aboriginal community for welcoming me at their campfire and telling me many stories and sharing much with me. And also to you, Mel, for agreeing to share and facilitate this meeting and asking such good questions.
Yeah, and look, actually, there was a final question I thought I might throw at you just before we finish up. And that, from Delia Faulkner, says, this may feel like a trivial question, but I don't think it is. But what happened to Ernestine's son, Bob? So Ernestine did have a son, Bob, who was allegedly, and we think definitely, the son of the senior Packer. Is it R.C. Packer? Did I get that right?
Yeah. So it's always been hard for me to remember what went into the manuscript and what went out. And I think it was about 20,000 words longer when I submitted it, I have to tell you.
Yeah, so what happened to him in the end? We didn't really discuss him at the beginning, but there was a son. He did join Ernestine Hill on her later adventures as well. So
Bob was living with Ernestine towards the end. He'd split up with his first wife, and he was working at a bookshop in Brisbane with Louise Campbell, and who's his second cousin. I hope she won't mind me saying this, but it's all in the archives. So he started a relationship with Louise after he broke up with his wife, and they were never married, but they lived and they went on road trips together for many years and shared an interest in books. A lot of Bob's letters I found quite sad, I think, and like he wrote to Mary Durack, who he'd also had an affair with in his youth, towards the end of his life, expressing a lot of regrets. And there was always some hope that Bob would become this amazing artist. And I think it's a bit hard for people who are born to a parent who's had some sort of fame or notoriety to live up to that. Like, he wanted to have some sort of creative expression, but it never really kind of happened for Bob. And there's a sense of regret and waste in his letters. And he was often depicted by others as being this kind of dissolute sort of buffoon until Louise took him in hand.
So somewhat sad ending point, but also, again, you know, part of the legacy of these extraordinary women. So before we go, and we really only have 5 minutes left on this Zoom,
Oh,
so
no.
I really want to get to the end. I'd like to propose a toast, quite a long one. Here's to Eleanor, to the two complex, extraordinary, and very flawed women who inspired this book, Daisy Bates and Ernestine Hill. And of course, all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who now and then tell their own stories. These are all the stories of this place we find ourselves on. So please raise a toast. And I would like to declare this book officially launched. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Now, Eleanor, did you want to unmute the chat?
I'll see if I can.
So you can hear these. If you'd like to clap, Eleanor, I believe, and I might see if I can do the same. My mouse is a bit wild at the moment.
Oh, that sounds noisier.
Yeah, so
I think I can hear clapping. Thanks. Thanks, Jenny.
So for